Keep firing! Don't let up!
I can't see anything!
Watch the left flank!
Staff Sergeant Marcus Kellan felt the heat of Helmand Province like a physical weight, a heavy, baking pressure that crushed the air and turned every breath into a chore. The dust was worse, fine as talcum powder and tasting of metal and ancient baked earth. It coated everything: the HESCO barriers, the camouflaged gear, the insides of their throats, and, most disturbingly, the silent, tense faces of the British troops they were relieving. "Welcome to the Rock, lads," said a visibly exhausted British corporal named Davies, his eyes bloodshot and darting. His uniform was immaculate, but the man inside it looked like he hadn't slept since the Queen was crowned. Kellan spat gritty saliva onto the baked ground. OP Rock wasn't a rock at all, merely a significant rise of sun-blasted earth topped with a motley collection of sandbags and observation posts. It was strategically vital, but felt utterly forsaken, a scar on the pale, monotonous landscape. "Rough rotation, Corporal?" Kellan asked, keeping his tone light and professional. Davies didn't meet his gaze. He stared past Kellan at the surrounding terrain, which shimmered and warped in the midday heat. "It's not the fighting, Sergeant. It's the atmosphere. It's heavy." Kellan's team, Lance Corporal Vega, the comms expert, Private First Class Reyes, the jumpy but reliable rifleman, and Doc Winston, the quiet corpsman, were unloading gear, trying to ignore the palpable anxiety radiating off the British. "Give us the turnover, quick as you can. Intel, patrol routes, trouble spots." Davies rattled off the logistics with the speed of a man desperate to leave. He pointed out the main trench line. "We tried to deepen it. The ground, it's difficult. The whole place is a mess of ruins under the dirt. Local interpreters say it's been a fighting position for thousands of years. They call it a cursed spot." "Ruins," Reyes muttered, squinting. "Ancient, mate. Bones and old bits of tin mixed into the soil," Davies said, finally locking eyes with Kellan. His voice dropped to a ragged whisper. "Just don't dig, and check your comms at the 0300 shift change. Stuff happens." Before Kellan could ask what stuff meant, the British team scrambled into their armored vehicles, leaving a thick cloud of saffron dust. They departed with indecent haste, not even waiting for a proper inventory sign-off. The departing vehicles looked less like military transports and more like hearses fleeing a graveyard. Kellan watched them go, the unsettling speed of their exit leaving a cold knot in his stomach. He turned to his men. "All right, gentlemen, we got 60 days on the gravy train. We secure the perimeter, we deepen those trenches, and we don't talk about ghosts. Got it?" The responses were affirmative, but the men's eyes were already scanning the desolate, silent terrain, searching for an enemy they knew should be there, but couldn't yet see. The first 3 days were spent in grueling labor under a relentless sun. The British trenches were indeed far too shallow. Standing upright, a Marine's head was a beacon for any sniper nestled in the jagged ridges 1,000 meters away. The only solution was to dig. "This sucks, Staff Sergeant," Reyes groaned, wiping sweat and mud from his goggles. His shovel hit a stubborn, rounded object. "Feels like I hit a damn petrified log." "Move it, Reyes. We need another foot of depth before sundown," Kellan ordered, equally exhausted. Reyes pried the object loose. It was long, pale, and curved. As he knocked the heavy soil away, a cheerless silence fell over the trench. It wasn't a log. It was a human femur, perfectly preserved, its surface smooth and hard. Doc Winston, who had been filling HESCO baskets nearby, knelt, his medical curiosity overriding his immediate revulsion. "Looks old. Maybe 100 years, maybe more. It's dense." The discovery should have been a grim curiosity, a footnote of history. But as they continued to dig around the find spot, the trickle became a flood. Within an hour, the trenches looked less like defensive positions and more like an impromptu archaeological dig. The Marines unearthed pottery shards of an unknown age, fragments of rusted, heavily hammered iron, and then distinctly modern items. A corroded Soviet-issue canteen, the tattered remains of a uniform jacket, and, most horrifyingly, a cracked, mud-caked human skull wearing a Soviet helmet from the 1980s. "Sweet Jesus," Vega whispered, dropping his shovel. "They just buried them right here." By the end of the day, working meticulously to respect the dead even as they violated their resting place, the 4 Marines had unearthed the skeletal remains of at least 16 people in their tiny 90-foot trench line. There were Soviet troops, identifiable by gear remnants, more ancient bones mixed with brittle bronze objects, and then some that appeared to be from the recent conflict, perhaps local fighters. Op Rock was not just a graveyard. It was the graveyard, layer upon layer of death, disturbed and exposed to the Helmand sun. The next morning, Kellan used the satellite phone to call the nearest patrol base for guidance. The response was clinical. Reinter the remains respectfully. Continue mission. Document finds. But the ground itself seemed to protest. As they tried to cover the skeletons, the air, already thick with dust, grew perceptibly colder, heavy with a damp, metallic odor that smelled less like dust and more like blood. Duck Winston remarked that the temperature drop was localized, confined only to the trench line. That night, the shift rotation began in earnest. The sense of being watched was almost unbearable, a constant, pricking sensation on the back of the neck. Kellan took the 0300 to 0600 watch. The moon was a sliver, and the star field above was a sharp, diamond-scattered void. He was positioned in the main observation post, scanning the darkness with his AN/PVS-14 night vision monocular. Everything was routine. The shadows of the ridges, the low hum of the generator, the crackle of the encrypted radio on a low volume next to Vega, who was sleeping curled up against a HESCO wall nearby. Then the anomaly began. The radio static sharpened, not the usual white noise, but a guttural hiss, like hot oil hitting a damp pan. Kellan reached over to adjust the squelch, but before his hand touched the dial, a sound cut through the hiss. It was a voice, a low, rapid whisper in a language Kellan didn't recognize, but which carried an undeniable tone of urgency and profound distress. It sounded choked, desperate, like someone trying to shout while underwater. Kellan froze, his hand suspended above the radio. He glanced at Vega, who was still asleep, his breathing even. The radio's output was too low to wake him. The voice ceased, replaced by the normal, low static. Just a flutter of residual frequency, maybe a rogue broadcast skipping off the ionosphere, Kellan told himself, a boilerplate explanation he'd heard 100 times. 2 minutes later, it returned, but this time it was clearer, sharper. Kellan felt a chill that cut through his fatigue, a chill far colder than the desert night. The voice was unmistakably Russian, spitting out clipped, panicked words. "Tavarish, vremya, vyet, vyet." "Comrade, time, out, out." Kellan yanked the handset to his ear. "Fox 19, this is Rock. Say again last. We have noise on the line." Silence. Just the low, encrypted static. He looked at the radio's frequency display. It was set correctly. This was impossible. Encrypted frequency hopping ensured that only authorized transceivers could broadcast, unless the voice wasn't coming from a radio at all. Kellan felt the air in the OP grow suddenly frigid, a column of concentrated cold that made the hair on his arms stand up. It carried with it a fleeting, putrid stench, the smell of old, forgotten decay, like a grave opened to the sun. The sensation lasted only a few seconds before the desert heat reasserted itself, leaving Kellan shaking, his heart pounding a furious rhythm against his ribs. He didn't report it. He couldn't. The experience, however, was catching. The following night, it was Reyes's turn. He was positioned at the western firing aperture, his eyes straining against the moonless void. He had been jumpy ever since the bone discovery and was compensating with caffeine and a rigid adherence to watch discipline. At 0130, Reyes heard it, not through the radio, but directly in his ear. A sound like a dry breath, followed by a soft, sibilant whisper. Reyes. It was his name, said with a chilling, possessive familiarity, right next to his head. He spun around, rifle raised, muzzle sweeping the tight confines of the firing position. Nothing, only the rough canvas of the roof and the stacked sandbags. The space was too small for anyone to have approached and retreated so quickly. He backed up against the HESCO, breathing heavily, checking his gear. He radioed Kellan, his voice tight. "Rock Actual, this is West Post. Request permission to stand up and do a quick perimeter check of the inner trench. Possible thermal reading." He lied about the thermal reading because the truth was inadmissible. Kellan, sensing the panic, granted permission immediately. Reyes scrambled out, moving with a controlled, frantic energy, checking every corner and shadow. He found nothing, of course. When he finally returned to his post, the air in the aperture was suffocatingly hot, but his body was racked with uncontrolled shivers. The unsettling audio phenomena quickly gave way to visual terror, confirming to the men that they were experiencing a collective haunting, not simply combat fatigue. The incidents started small, manifesting as lights. During Kellan's next shift, he saw them again. The muzzle flashes described in the old British turnover file. About 400 meters out, near the base of a jagged hillock, faint sporadic flickers of orange and yellow light erupted. They were irregular, like small arms fire from a rifle that was badly malfunctioning. Kellan raised his binoculars. The flashes were there, visible and distinct. But they were silent, absolutely silent. No snap of a round, no echo of a shot, no trace of the tracers that usually illuminated the night. They were lights without origin, the visual aftermath of violence detached from the event. He grabbed the radio. "Rock, this is West Post. Contact. 400 meters out, bearing 240. Muzzle flashes, sporadic. No accompanying sound. Confirming visual." Vega was quick on the radio. "Roger, Rock. Can you confirm hostile intent?" "Negative. Just the flashes. They stop and start. It's like watching a silent movie of a firefight." As Kellan spoke, one flash erupted far too close, right outside the HESCO wall of the OP, where no enemy could be. It was blindingly bright, casting Reyes' shadow onto the canvas roof, but producing no noise, no heat, and no dust signature. It was as if the ancient, buried combatants were trapped in a loop, their guns firing in the spectral realm, the flashes bleeding over into the real world. The atmosphere grew heavier, suffocating. Doc Winston began reporting cases of acute, crippling paranoia among the team, far beyond normal combat stress. "Staff Sergeant, PFC Reyes is refusing to sleep," Winston reported softly. "He says if he closes his eyes, he can smell the rot from the ground, and he'll hear the Russian whispers telling him the firing position is compromised. He's running on 4 hours of sleep in 72. Kellan looked at his men. They were a skeleton crew, worn down not by enemy contact, but by the relentless, silent siege of the land itself. The major visual event occurred 2 nights later. It was 0200. Vega was on watch with Doc Winston. Vega was using the thermal sight, sweeping the perimeter. The heat signature of the desert ground was uniform, save for a few thermal blobs of wild dogs scavenging far off. Suddenly, a massive cold spot appeared on the thermal screen, moving slowly and purposefully from the south. "Staff Sergeant, I have something." Vega's voice was strained, high-pitched. "It's cold, sub-ambient, massive profile, south perimeter." Kellan scrambled to the observation post, grabbing a secondary thermal optic. He looked where Vega pointed. The figure was not a thermal signature. It was a negative signature, a cold void moving against the warm backdrop of the desert night. Then they saw it with their naked eyes. It wasn't a shadow. It was a faint, translucent silhouette, illuminated by the distant city glow, but somehow absorbing light rather than reflecting it. The figure was moving in the low ground, walking directly toward the OP southern approach. It was wearing an olive-drab uniform, bulky and ill-fitting, the unmistakable outline of a Soviet soldier carrying a spectral AK-74 rifle at the low ready. It was not running or crawling. It was patrolling, stuck in an endless, mournful repetition of a task it could never complete. "It's the Russian," Kellan breathed, his training fighting a losing battle with the primal terror in his mind. "He's getting closer, Staff Sergeant," Reyes yelled from the trench, his voice trembling. The apparition reached the halfway point, then the quarter mark. It was 30 meters away, and Kellan could make out the details. A ghost of a face, etched with a century of fatigue and shock, eyes that seemed to glow with a deep, sorrowful blackness. Kellan had never seen a hostile this close without firing, but his finger hovered over the trigger, paralyzed. It's not real. It's a trick of the light, the heat, the sleep deprivation. The figure kept walking, right up to the edge of the shallow trench line where the Marines had unearthed its comrades. It paused, tilted its helmeted head, and then, in a clear, echoing voice that sounded like it was being broadcast from inside Kellan's skull, it spoke one single, chilling word in perfect, unaccented English. Home. That was the trigger. Reyes screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure psychological rupture, and opened fire. His M16 barked, 3-round bursts tearing into the air where the specter stood. Kellan, jarred by the sound, snapped out of his paralysis and joined in, suppressing his fear with kinetic action. The rounds passed straight through the figure, kicking up dust and rock behind it. The phantom soldier didn't react to the gunfire. It simply dissolved, slowly and reluctantly, like smoke being absorbed back into the black earth. When the muzzle flashes subsided and the echoes faded, the only sound was the heavy, labored breathing of 4 Marines who had just fired a massive volume of ammunition at the air. The shooting incident changed everything. The cover was blown. Kellan had to report engaging a non-existent target. The explanation, heat stroke, collective stress, and possible enemy distraction, was logged, but the unspoken truth hung over them like a toxic gas. The malevolence of the rock intensified, moving from atmospheric dread to direct physical harassment. The radios, already a source of terror, became unmanageable. They would randomly transmit deafening bursts of static, or worse, pick up a chorus of muffled, disembodied screams that cut off abruptly. Then came the incident with the Humvees. A resupply convoy arrived just before dusk, bringing fresh water and desperately needed morale. The American team, along with their attached Afghan National Army interpreter and security element, was gathered around the vehicles. Suddenly, without a lick of wind, the tall radio antennas mounted on the roofs of the Humvees began to whip violently. They snapped from side to side, arcing back and forth with impossible force, bending the heavy metal mounts. It was an uncanny, impossible motion, like something massive and invisible was shaking them in a fit of silent rage. The ANA soldiers froze, their eyes wide with fear. The Afghan interpreter, a weathered man named Karim, dropped his radio handset. "What the hell is that?" shouted the convoy commander. Karim's face was pale. "The locals, they speak of the Djinn, spirits of the land. They do not like the iron poles. They push." He looked at Kellan, his eyes pleading. "They are angry we have disturbed the dead." The antennas stopped as abruptly as they had started, but the effect was devastating. The ANA element refused to dismount their vehicles, refusing to stay another night on the rock. They would take their chances on the open road. The Marines were now truly alone, utterly isolated on their haunted skeletal remains. The sense of despair became paramount. It wasn't just fear, it was a crushing psychological weight that convinced the men they were failures, that their mission was futile, and that the only logical release was to stop breathing simply. Doc Winston, the corpsman, found Lance Corporal Vega sitting on his cot, his M4 resting in his lap, the barrel pointed at the ground between his feet. Vega was staring blankly, tears tracking paths through the grime on his face.
"I can't do it, Doc," Vega whispered, his voice empty. "It won't let me sleep. It wants me to join them. I keep thinking about the mud, the cold mud. It's calling me down." Winston pulled the rifle from Vega's slack hands, his own fingers shaking. He knew this wasn't simple depression. The rock was actively attacking their minds, using their fatigue and isolation as a weapon. He had to get them out. The mission be damned. Kellan, observing the rapid deterioration of his men, made the difficult call. He filed an emergency exfiltration request, citing critical infrastructure failure and overwhelming psychological casualty rate. He didn't use the word paranormal, but he didn't need to. Command had read the British files. They knew. The extraction helicopter arrived under the cover of a fierce, unnaturally localized dust storm that boiled up from the south, the direction of the spectral soldier. The crew chief refused to land fully, hovering a few feet above the ground, the dust and rotor wash kicking up the soil, releasing a final, terrible wave of the rotten flesh stench. As the Marines scrambled aboard, throwing their gear into the chopper, Kellan took one final look at the rock. The skeletal remains they had reburied were now partially exposed again, washed clean by the fierce wind. The trenches looked like open wounds. Then he saw it. Not a shadow, not a light, but a ripple in the air, a visible distortion moving across the top of the trench line. It was massive and silent, flowing like disturbed water. Kellan felt a wave of cold dread so intense it buckled his knees. He realized the things they had seen, the Russian, the lights, the whispers, were just fragments, symptoms of something far larger, more ancient, and infinitely hungrier dwelling beneath the soil. The Djinn, the curse, the collective horror of millennia of warfare, all condensed into a place that simply didn't want the living to occupy it. The crew chief yelled over the rotor noise, "Go! Go! We got a lift, Sergeant!" Kellan lunged into the helicopter, kicking the last of his gear in behind him. As the bird climbed, banking away from the cursed rise of the ground, Kellan looked down. He saw the antennas on the abandoned Humvees begin to whip again, violently, welcoming the returning silence. And then, far below, near the edge of the newly exposed trenches, a faint, sickly white light began to glow, steady and low, illuminating the place where the Russian soldier had dissolved. It was an empty land, but it was not uninhabited. Uprock was simply waiting for the next empire to lay its foundations on the bones of the last, ready to claim their souls as part of its terrible, eternal garrison. The Marines who served at O.P. Rock never spoke of the ghosts or the screams. They spoke only of the heat, the dust, and the oppressive, crushing silence of the desert. But late at night, in the sudden drop of temperature in an air-conditioned room, or the faint metallic scent of rot that briefly crosses their path, they know. They know the graveyard of empires is still waiting, and they were lucky, or maybe just temporarily permitted, to leave.